The prophecy spoke of a new age, a celestial alignment, and the forging of a sacred bond. They failed, however, to mention the guy in the corner illegally siphoning the party favors with a jury-rigged purging device. Of all the ways Malric Nightbriar had imagined getting arrested, causing the supreme ruler of an ancient, powerful elven empire to burst into tears in front of an audience spanning the known realms hadn't even made the top 100. Illegally siphoning priceless starlight wine using a jury-rigged alchemical siphon he'd built from a healer's purging device and a stolen focusing runestone, however, was number 6. He was currently engaged in the latter, pretending to inspect a floor-level grate. His real work was 10 feet away, behind a floating alabaster plinth that hummed with quiet, unbearable perfection. An hour ago, dressed in the legitimate robes of a journeyman artificer for the Althenian arcane works, Malric had been attuning the plinth's ambient mana regulators. It was a joke of a job, but it got him past the wards, and while he was behind the plinth, he'd planted his siphoning gear, attaching the needle-thin tube to a service conduit that fed the wine into the plinth's core for some ridiculously elven reason he couldn't fathom. Now in a poorly fitting, borrowed server's tunic, he was back to retrieve the flagon, banking on the idea that no one ever looks twice at the help. The Athelian sanctum wasn't so much a room as it was a challenge to the laws of creation. A place of impossible, non-Euclidean geometry and light that seemed to pour from the very air. To Malric, it looked like a high priest's sterile, too-bright bathroom, and it was giving him a headache. The raw ether in the hall was so thick it felt like a pressure against his skin, making the air taste faintly of copper and raising the hairs on his arms. "Just a little more," he muttered, watching a glowing fill rune on the side of the enchanted flagon. The wine, a luminous liquid that tasted like a collision of starlight and summer fruit, was meant for the elven elite. Malric figured it would taste just as good mixed with cheap dwarfen grog in a dirty mug back at his workshop. Survival, after all, was about creative resource allocation. Up front, the main event was building to its climax. Queen Ellenweith, a being of such severe and statuesque beauty that she made statues look clumsy, stood before a levitating altar. Upon it rested a single obsidian egg, veined with pulsing crimson light, the first dragon egg to grace the realms in 1,000 years. The air crackled with anticipation and the kind of reverent silence that made Malric's teeth itch. "By the sacred resonance, by the celestial alignment, by the covenant of ages," Ellenweith's voice was like spun glass, each word a perfectly crafted note in a symphony of magical importance. "We call forth the air of the fire, the heart of ether, the soul of creation. Let the bond be forged anew." The fill rune on the flagon pulsed once and went dark. Full. Malric spoke a quiet command word, and the siphon tube detached itself. He began to casually edge his way toward the plinth for retrieval, just as a loud crack echoed through the sanctum. The obsidian egg fractured, not with a simple break, but as if it were unfolding from the inside out. Shards of shell turned to glittering dust and vanished. From the heart of the crimson light emerged a creature no bigger than a house cat. It was all sharp angles and glistening jet-black scales. It blinked, its eyes molten gold, and took in the cavernous hall filled with 100 motionless, worshipful elves. Then it sneezed. A puff of sparks shot from its tiny nostrils, smelling faintly of cinnamon and superheated dust. Queen Ellenweith raised her hands, her fingers weaving intricate patterns in the air. "Come, Ignis," she commanded, her voice softening with a possessive tenderness. "Come to your keeper. Let our souls entwine. Let order guide your flame." The little dragon, Ignis, tilted its head. It looked at the imperious queen, a beacon of pure, controlled power. It looked at the assembled nobles, silent and perfect. Then its golden eyes scanned the room, sweeping past the grandeur and landing on the one thing that didn't belong, a fidgety human in a borrowed tunic, a man whose very presence was an act of low-grade larceny. Ignis chirped, a high-pitched, scraping sound. It ignored the queen entirely. With a determined waddle that was far too clumsy for a creature of legend, it hopped off the altar and made a beeline for Malric. Malric froze mid-stride. "Oh no, 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 no," he whispered. "I'm just the peasant guy, the wine guy. Go to the shiny lady." The dragon paid him no mind. It reached him and sniffed his grease-stained trousers. But its attention wasn't on the smells of stolen wine and desperation. Its golden eyes were fixed on his right boot, where a snapped lace had been replaced with a meticulously braided strand of copper wire. It cocked its head, then nudged the jury-rigged whisper box in his jacket pocket, a device he'd built himself from the parts of 3 different broken sending stones. It let out a chirp of what sounded like profound fascination. This human wasn't just a creature of flesh. He was a nexus of clever, chaotic fixes. Then it rubbed its head against his leg, a gesture of such profound and immediate affection that it felt like a jolt of raw magic. A blinding flash of golden light erupted from the point of contact. It was raw, chaotic, and felt like sticking his finger into the heart of a raging thunderstorm. The light seared a complex, shifting rune onto the back of his right hand, a brand of incandescent gold that felt both burning hot and freezing cold. An identical, smaller rune blazed to life on the dragon's forehead. The bond was made. For a solid, heart-stopping second, the only sound in the Athelian sanctum was the faint hum of the levitating plinths. The elves stared, their perfect composure shattered into a million pieces of disbelief. Malric stared at the rune on his hand, then at the little dragon now purring and contentedly trying to chew on his wired-up bootlace. Then came the sound that would be whispered about in taverns and throne rooms from the shining cities to the broken marches. The elf queen, Elenweith, ruler of the Athelian Empire, let out a single, piercing sob of pure, unadulterated fury and humiliation. The elf queen wept as the last dragon hatchling chose a human keeper. The sound died as quickly as it came. Her grief collapsed inward, crystallizing into something infinitely harder and more dangerous. Her face, moments before a canvas of shock, became a mask of glacial wrath. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, fixed on Malric. "The ritual is tainted," she declared, her voice devoid of all warmth, a weapon honed to a razor's edge. "The human has corrupted the bond with his filth. He is a blight." She pointed a single elegant finger. "Seize the blight and secure the hatchling." The royal guard, 6 figures in polished ornate armor, moved as one. Their spell lances crackled to life, humming with lethal intent. Malric's brain, which had been enjoying a brief vacation in the land of sheer panic, kicked back into gear. He did what any good artificer would do in a crisis. He assessed his available tools. 1 flagon of highly volatile, illegally siphoned starlight wine. 1 floating serving tray made of some ridiculously expensive enchanted weirwood. 1 small purring, world-altering dragon. "Right," he said to no one in particular. "Improvised exit strategy it is." He snatched the wine flagon off the floor and grabbed the floating tray, holding it up like a shield. The first guard lunged, his lance striking the tray with a deafening clang. The impact sent a shockwave up Malric's arm, but the weirwood held. "Nice material," Malric grunted. "Could use this for a golden chassis." He needed a distraction. With his free hand, he twisted the stopper off his flagon and flung it in a wide arc. The luminous wine sloshed through the air, drenching the other 5 guards. They paused, confused, dripping with the realm's most exclusive beverage. Then the liquid hit their active spell lances. The result was not an explosion, it was something far more specific, and, for the guards, far more unpleasant. The highly conductive wine acted as an arcane dampening agent, creating an instantaneous, massive mana feedback loop. The lances didn't detonate, they overloaded. With a blinding flash of blue-white light and a high-pitched scream of failing focusing crystals, they discharged their entire magical charge in a single violent pulse. The shafts glowed cherry red, superheating in a fraction of a second. The guards screamed, dropping the weapons with scorched, smoking hands, momentarily blinded and stunned. "Note to self," Malric yelled over the chaos. "Starlight wine is an excellent, if expensive, magical suppressor." He didn't wait for a response. He scooped up the purring dragon, tucked it into the front of his tunic, and bolted. Ignis poked its head out, looking thrilled. He skidded around a corner, the queen's enraged screams echoing behind him. He needed a way out. His eyes landed on an enchanted cleaning disc parked in an alcove, a small, open-topped platform designed for polishing floors, not high-speed getaways. Perfect. The activation required an authorized palm print on a complex runic array. Malric didn't have time for that. He skidded to a halt, his eyes scanning the control lectern. "A Janitor's Guild Model 3, he muttered with a smirk. "Classic. Always knew the guild cut corners." He rummaged in his pocket, passed a loose cog and a half-eaten jerky stick, and pulled out a bent, three-pronged spork. They use a common null rune to save on attuned components. He jammed the spork, not randomly, but precisely, into a small, almost invisible seam below the palm scanner, targeting the specific null point he knew was there. The disc sputtered, whined, and then roared to life with a jolt that nearly threw him off. He grabbed the guiding tiller and gunned it, blasting down the pristine hallway. Ahead was a colossal stained glass window depicting a famous elven victory over some forgotten foe. It looked ancient, sacred, and extremely expensive. "Sorry about your window!" Malric shouted, and aimed directly for the center. The disc, the human, and the dragon crashed through 1,000 years of artistic heritage in a glittering explosion of colored glass, bursting out into the open air of the Athelian floating city. Below them, a dizzying abyss of clouds and smog beckoned. Malric pushed the disc into a steep, reckless dive, plunging into the chaotic underlevels, the air instantly shifting from sterile purity to the thick metallic smell of overtaxed air-purifying glyphs, fried street food, and damp stone. They found refuge in a grimy maintenance tunnel. The purloined disc had died a noble, if violent, death. The spork-violated arcane core, pushed far beyond its design specs, had given out not with a puff of smoke, but with a catastrophic burnout, unleashing a chaotic flare of raw, unobstructed magic that fired every glyph on board and left a lingering, messy magical signature in its wake. Malric sat on a bundle of mana conduits, his heart hammering against his ribs. In his lap, Ignis was curled into a ball, fast asleep. Malric gently stroked its obsidian scales. A strange warmth spread from the rune on his hand, a feeling of connection that was both alien and deeply comforting. He could feel the little dragon's dreams, chaotic swirls of color, the satisfying texture of copper wire, and a powerful, unwavering sense of safety with him. His thoughts were interrupted as every public scrying mirror in the tunnel flickered to life simultaneously. The Queen's face appeared, no longer furious, but a picture of serene, sorrowful authority. "Subjects of the Allied Kingdoms," she announced, her voice resonating with carefully crafted grief. "Today, our most sacred rite has been desecrated. A human agent, a blasphemer known as Malric Nightbriar, infiltrated the sanctum. Before the sacred bond could be forged, he violently assaulted my royal guard and stole the last dragon egg from its consecrated altar." Malric's jaw dropped. "Stole the egg? I was stealing wine. The chronology is completely wrong." The Queen's image continued, a single perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek. "This creature, this thief, now holds the future of all the realms hostage. He is to be considered armed, dangerous, and a heretic of the highest order. A bounty is issued, effective immediately for his capture and the safe return of the blessed hatchling." The mirror flashed a smudged image of Malric from a security scrying stone, one that made him look particularly shifty, probably from the time he'd tried to barter a faulty power crystal for a tavern tab. He was no longer just an accidental participant in a botched ceremony. He was public enemy number one. The purring creature in his arm wasn't his companion. It was the realm's biggest prize, and he was the villain who had stolen it. "Well," Malric said to the sleeping dragon, "that's just fantastic." The bounty hunters found him less than 20 minutes later. 3 of them, an ogre built like a siege tower, and 2 wiry goblin twins who moved with a disconcerting, twitchy speed. They cornered him in a dead-end conduit intersection. The ogre held up a small, flickering arcane compass.
"It was one hell of a magical spike from that disc you fried, human,"
he growled, cracking his massive knuckles.
"Let us ride to you. Know where to run, now. Hand over the lizard, and we might just break one of your legs instead of all of them."
Malric held his hands up, Ignis stirring in his jacket. "Look, fellas, massive misunderstanding. The Queen's a bit of a drama queen, you know? Thinks a misplaced spork is a declaration of war." The goblin twins hissed and drew jagged knives, their beady eyes gleaming. They began to advance. Just as the ogre lunged, a sound shattered the air. It wasn't a spell or an explosion. It was a noise so profoundly, soul-crushingly awful that it felt like it was trying to turn Malric's skeleton inside out. It was the sound of a mountain grinding to dust, amplified by a factor of 1,000. The bounty hunters screamed, dropping their weapons to clutch at their heads. The goblin's sensitive ears practically bled. From a side tunnel, a figure emerged. It was an elf, but unlike any Malric had ever seen. She wore scuffed leather instead of flowing silks, and her hair was a messy, rebellious shock of silver. In her hands was a lute that looked more like an artificer's weapon than a bard's instrument. She was plucking a single hideously discordant note with a theatrical flourish.
"Is this gig booked?"
she drawled, her voice a cascade of wry amusement.
"Or are you open to a new opening act?"
Before Malric could answer, a second figure appeared behind the first. This one was a dwarf, broad as a bulkhead door and sporting a magnificent braided beard that was probably a fire hazard. He lobbed a small metal sphere that landed at the bounty hunter's feet. It erupted in a flash of blinding white light and a deafening boom. When Malric's vision cleared, the 3 hunters were unconscious on the floor. The dwarf walked over, a heavy-looking hammer slung over his shoulder. He glanced at the still flickering compass in the ogre's hand.
"That was a messy magical signature you left back there,"
he rumbled, his voice a low rumble, like rock shifting deep underground.
"Didn't feel like an elven spellcraft. Figure whoever made a mess that creative might have been in a spot of trouble."
He then looked at Malric, and finally at the little dragon head peeking out of his jacket. Ignis blinked its golden eyes at him. The dwarf's scowl softened almost imperceptibly.
"The bounty was for a thief and an egg," he said. "Not a man and a hatchling. Rorik doesn't hunt kids, dragon or not."
The elf woman grinned, a flash of sharp, subversive glee.
"And I,"
she said, giving her sonic lute a final, mercifully silent twang,
"couldn't pass up the opportunity to be the single greatest disappointment to my people in living memory. Ayella, at your service."
She executed a mocking bow.
"This is the most fun I've had since I got exiled for writing a ballad about the Queen's unfortunate hat choices."
Rorik grunted.
"We have an airship, if you want passage."
Malric looked from the unconscious bounty hunters to the 2 misfits who had just saved him. An exiled elven bard with a weaponized instrument, and a dwarfen demolitions expert with a penchant for investigating creative messes. It was the worst rescue party he could have imagined. "Yeah," Malric said, a slow, tired grin spreading across his face. "Okay, passage sounds good." The airship was called the Rusty Mug, and it looked exactly like it sounded. It was a cobbled-together cargo hauler skyship that seemed to be held aloft by a little more than stubbornness, mismatched rivets, and what looked suspiciously like troll gut binding. To Malric, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Inside, it smelled of scorched rune strips, spilled ale, and goat. "Ah, our fugitive has arrived," a voice said. It was dry, condescending, and emanated from a small white goat that was calmly chewing on a stray mana leech vine. The goat wore a slightly too large pair of spectacles perched on its nose. "Do not try to drip your chaotic human essence all over my navigator's astrolabe. It's finely tuned." Malric stared. "You have a talking goat." "I am Bartholomew, Archmage of the Fifth Circle, and this caprine form is the result of a trifling curse from a jealous rival," the goat sniffed. "And I am the only reason this flying scrap heap hasn't fallen out of the sky into its component parts. Now, place the dragon somewhere it won't try to eat the chronometer." As Rorik headed for the helm and Aella started theatrically polishing her lute, Bartholomew trotted over to Malric. He peered at the rune on Malric's hand. "Extraordinary," the goat mage murmured. "A raw, untamed bond. The elves believe the bond requires discipline, order, rigid formula. They spend decades training to receive it. You, a primate with the magical sensitivity of a brick, have managed it by accident." "Story of my life," Malric said, finding a relatively clean spot on a crate to sit. Ignis hopped out and immediately began investigating a loose floorboard. "Don't you understand what this is?" Bartholomew said, his voice losing some of its pompousness. "The dragon bond is a key. It allows the keeper to channel ether directly, to reshape reality through sheer force of will, bypassing all the tedious incarnations and runic arrays. The elves use their rigid minds to create precise, controlled effects. You," he looked at Malric up and down, "are an artificer. You don't think in terms of order. You think in terms of jury-rigging, improvisation, and hitting things until they work. In your hands, this power could be spectacularly unpredictable. It could unravel the very tapestry of creation." "Great," Malric sighed. "So I'm a walking cosmic anomaly with a goat for a navigator. Could this day get any weirder?" Ignis, having pried up the floorboard, pulled out a squeaky toy that had clearly been lost for years and began shaking it triumphantly. "Yes," Bartholomew said grimly, "it absolutely could." The first stop was the notorious market of Kazakh Spire, a grimy hub of illicit trade and questionable artifice. The rusty mug needed a new mana injector for its sputtering arcane engine, and Rorik knew a guy. The problem was, they were broke. "We need parts, not attention," Malric instructed, cradling Ignis as they prepared to disembark into the bustling, soot-stained marketplace. "So I need you to just blend in. Look valuable, but ignorable. Can you do that?" Ignis chirped and snuggled into his arms. Malric took that as a yes. He stepped off the gangplank and looked down. Ignis was gone. In his hands, he was now holding a solid gold, jewel-encrusted goblet. It was intricately detailed, impossibly gaudy, and looked like it had been stolen from a tyrannical emperor's treasure vault. Malric closed his eyes. Valuable but ignorable. Right, of course. Rorik's eyes widened.
"By my grandfather's forge, we're rich."
"We're not rich, we're conspicuous," Malric hissed, trying to hide the ridiculous opulent goblet inside his tunic. Change back now!" But Ignis, as a goblet, seemed quite pleased with himself. Their destination was a noisy, smoke-filled tavern that served as the local black market. They found their contact, a shady-looking orc named Slicks, at a corner table. As Rorik began to haggle over the price of the mana injector, Malric tried to remain as inconspicuous as possible while holding an object that screamed, "Rob me." He set the goblet down on the table. It was a mistake. A massive, tusked hobgoblin warlord at the next table, flanked by two ogre guards, eyed the goblet with greedy interest.
"That's a fine cup you have there, human,"
the warlord grunted. "It's a replica," Malric said quickly. "A cheap knockoff, basically worthless." The goblet seemed to take offense. A single, slender tentacle, also made of solid gold, sprouted from its base. Before Malric could react, the tentacle whipped out, deftly plucked the warlord's coin pouch from his belt, and retracted back into the goblet with a faint plink. There was a moment of stunned silence. The hobgoblin looked down at his empty belt, then at the goblet. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple.
"You know,"
Aella said, leaning back in her chair with a sigh of pure theatrical delight,
"I was just thinking this place lacked a certain dramatic tension."
The warlord roared and flipped the table. The tavern erupted into a full-scale brawl. Rorik, in his element, grabbed a chair and waded in with a joyful bellow. Aella unslung her lute and unleashed a focused sonic pulse that made all the bottles behind the bar shatter in a cascading symphony of destruction. Malric just grabbed the goblet dragon and ran. They barely made it back to the airship, the sounds of the brawl and the enraged roars of a robbed warlord echoing behind them. Safely on board, the goblet finally turned back into a little dragon, who coughed up the coin pouch and looked immensely proud of himself. "Okay," Malric said, catching his breath. "New rule. No more shape-shifting into priceless artifacts." Ignis just licked his chin, the feeling of mischievous glee flooding their bond. Queen Ellenweath was not pleased. The reports from the bounty hunter guilds were a litany of failure and farce. Her quarry was not only evading capture, but was leaving a trail of chaos and mockery in his wake. The Gold Goblet incident in Kazakh Spire was already a viral legend in the criminal underworld. Her pride, already wounded, was now festering. The incompetence of her underlings was infuriating.
"They treat this as a common bounty," she seethed,
pacing the bridge of her flagship skyship, the Starfall.
"They say a human thief, not cosmic blasphemy."
She stopped before the celestial map shimmering in her scrying mirror. This couldn't be left to mercenaries and fools. It was time to unleash a more precise instrument. "Commander," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper,
"deploy the Crimson Templars, all of them. I want the human cornered. I want the dragon secured. And I want this embarrassment to my reign erased."
The commander bowed low, a flicker of fear in his eyes. The Crimson Templars were not guards or soldiers. They were the Queen's personal spell hunters, silent and deadly assassins who moved like ghosts and struck like vipers. They hadn't been deployed as a full unit in over a century. This was no longer a retrieval, it was a hunt. They found them at a derelict monastery, a crumbling ruin built into a floating mountain that was slowly drifting through a shimmering magical miasma. It was the perfect place to lie low. It was also the perfect place to be ambushed. Malric was in the monastery's chamber of null gravity, a vast spherical room with floating debris and shattered stained glass, trying to teach Ignis the concept of fetch with a floating chunk of rock. The dragon found it much more amusing to simply phase through the rock instead. That's when they struck. 6 figures in blood-red armor dropped from the shadows, their boots enchanted with runes of clinging, holding fast to the curved walls. The Crimson Templars. They moved with an eerie, coordinated silence.
"Rorik, Aella, we've got company!"
Malric yelled into his sending stone. He grabbed Ignis and pushed off a wall drifting through the weightless chamber. A blast of focused energy shot past his head, sizzling the air. The chase was on. He dodged behind floating pews and crumbling statues, the Templars in silent, relentless pursuit. He got separated from the others in the labyrinth corridors. He dove into what looked like an old scurrying chamber, a mess of broken crystal balls and burnt rune strips. A blast sealed the doorway behind him. He was trapped. The Templar leader entered through a hole in the ceiling, landing silently. The Templar drew a blade that glowed with contained deadly magic. There was no escape. Malric's mind went into overdrive. He had no weapon. He had no idea how to use the bond for anything other than fueling Ignis's mischief. He was a fraud, an artificer, facing a master of magical combat, so he bluffed. He grabbed a splintered divining rod in one hand and a cracked power stone in the other, holding them together like they were some arcane artifact. He pointed it at the Templar. "You don't want to do this," Malric yelled, trying to sound much more confident than he felt. "I'm rerouting the primary monoflow directly through the astral conduit. The feedback loop will be catastrophic." The Templar shifted its head, clearly having no idea what any of those words meant, which was fair because Malric was just screaming nonsense arcane terms. "I'm polarizing the chronal matrices!" Malric screamed, pushing the two pieces of junk closer together. "It's gonna blow!" Ignis, tucked in his jacket, could feel the rising tide of sheer, unadulterated panic flooding through their bond. The little dragon didn't understand the words, but it understood the intent. Malric needed a big, scary effect now. So Ignis helped. He let loose a powerful, fiery burp. It wasn't a huge gout of flame, more like a supercharged forge bellow, but it shot out and hit a pocket of volatile alchemical gas leaking from a ruptured pipe right in front of the Templar. The resulting explosion was immense. It blew the Templar leader back out through the doorway, armor smoking, and shook the entire chamber. Malric stood there, rod and stone still in hand, chest heaving. From the sending stone, he heard Rorik's voice.
"Malric, what was that? Did you do that?"
Yeah, Malric managed. "Just had to reverse the somatic polarity. You know, basic stuff." He looked down at Ignis, who chirped and licked his chin. Okay, maybe he wasn't a total fraud after all. On the bridge of the Starfall, Queen Elenweith listened to the report. Her Crimson Templar, his voice strained, described the encounter.
"He wields a terrifying and incomprehensible power, Your Majesty. He spoke in some arcane human tongue, words of power I did not recognize, and unleashed a force that... It was not like our magic. It was raw, unstructured, violent."
Elenweith dismissed the Templar. Her fist clenched. The human wasn't just evading her, he was learning. He was twisting the sacred bond into some crude, brutish weapon. A wizened elven advisor, one of the few who dared to speak his mind, stepped forward cautiously.
"Your Majesty,"
he began, his voice soft,
"perhaps this bond is not a corruption. Perhaps the ether has chosen a new expression. The ancient texts are not always clear. Your current path, this relentless pursuit, it risks alienating our more pious followers. They see a hunt, not a reclamation."
Elenweith turned on him, her eyes chips of ice.
"He corrupted it. He is a chaotic variable in a perfect equation. He will be excised,"
she hissed, her pride and fear overriding her wisdom.
"The natural order will be restored. There is no other way."
The advisor bowed his head and stepped back, silenced. The Queen was no longer listening to counsel. She was listening only to the echo of her own wounded authority. Back on the Rusty Mug, the mood was subdued. They had escaped, but it was a close call. Malric felt like a fake. He'd won by a lucky burp and a stream of technobabble. He wasn't a keeper. He was a hunted thief who'd gotten in way over his head. He retreated to the engine room, the only place on the skyship that felt like home. It was a chaotic masterpiece of Rorik's applied percussive maintenance, and Malric's own jury-rigged patches, a forest of copper pipes and glowing crystals. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the familiar hum of a barely functioning arcane core. Ignis hopped onto his lap, nudged his hand, and curled up. The little dragon didn't see a fraud or a thief. It didn't see a failure or a heretic. It just saw Malric. Through their bond, Ignis flooded him with a feeling of pure, simple, and absolute trust. It was a wave of unconditional belief so powerful, it almost knocked the wind out of him. Malric looked at the junk parts he still had in his hands from the monastery, the splintered rod, the cracked power stone. He looked at the engine around him, a testament to making things work with whatever you had on hand. A thought sparked in his mind, as bright and sudden as the bond itself. His failed academy projects, his habit of forcing ether through physical contraptions, instead of shaping it with his mind and words. Everyone had told him it was the wrong way, crude, inefficient, a brutish imitation of true magic. But was it wrong, or was it just different? Was it the human way? He didn't need to learn the elves' rigid, formulaic magic. He didn't have the discipline, the centuries of tradition, the innate talent. But he had something else. He had a mind that saw the universe as a collection of parts to be tinkered with. He had creativity born from necessity. He had chaos on his side. He looked down at the purring dragon in his lap. He didn't need to be an elven keeper. He needed to be a human artificer. He needed to embrace his own chaotic brand of creation. Malric burst onto the bridge, his eyes alight with a manic energy that made Aella raise an eyebrow and Bartholomew take a nervous step back. "Bartholomew, you're the Archmage, the ancient texts, the real dusty ones nobody reads. Is there anything about the first Dragon Bond? Not the elven version, the original one." The goat mage blinked.
"An interesting question. Most of that lore is forbidden. The elves redacted it centuries ago, declared it primitive blasphemy, but I may have committed some of it to memory before my unfortunate transformation."
He closed his eyes, humming thoughtfully.
"Ah, yes," he said after a moment. "The Codex Primoris. It doesn't say humans are the destined keepers. It says something far more interesting. The very first bond, before the elves codified the rituals, didn't respond to chants or prayers or perfect order."
Bartholomew opened his eyes, a spark of genuine excitement in them.
"It responded to an act of focused creation, the sheer driving intent of an early tool user trying to shape the world. A pre-human ancestor hammering a rock to make a sharper edge. The bond wasn't drawn to discipline, it was drawn to ingenuity, to the chaotic, messy, brilliant spark of invention."
The crew stared at him. "The elves completely misinterpreted it," Malric breathed, the pieces clicking into place. "They saw the focused will and assumed it meant mental order, so they built their entire religion around rigid control."
"And your method?"
Aella chimed in, a slow smile spreading across her face.
"Your artificer's heresy of jamming magic through machines, that's not an aberration? That is a return to first principles," Bartholomew finished. "That is the bond's native language."
Rorik, who'd been listening intently, slammed a meaty fist onto the console.
"So, where did all this first bond happen?"
"At a place of making," Bartholomew said, his voice filled with reverence. "A nexus of primordial power and raw material, known only as the Forge of the First King."
A new destination appeared on the navigator's chart, a blinking light in a region of the sky known for its warped ley lines. Their path was clear. They weren't just running anymore, they were heading for answers. Unfortunately, aboard the Starfall, a frantic lore keeper brought a newly translated fragment of the same forbidden text to Queen Ellenweath. She saw the words Forge and First King and understood instantly.
"He's not running," she whispered, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "He's racing."
She turned to her helm officer.
"Set a course. Maximum power to the engines. This heresy ends at its source."
The frantic chase across the sky was on. Rorik flew like a man possessed, weaving the rusty mug through fields of floating earth motes that would have given lesser pilots an aneurysm. Aella used her sonic lute to project ghost images of the skyship, sending elven patrols on wild goose chases. And Bartholomew, tapping into his ancient knowledge, guided them through a treacherous but much shorter route, a navigational nightmare guarded by whispering sky behemoths that made the goat's fur stand on end. They arrived first, but only by a hair. The Forge of the First King wasn't on a world, it was the world. A realm-sized dormant workshop of impossible scale, littered with the colossal, silent tools of forgotten gods. At its heart, In a vast open cavern stood a single, simple anvil made of black star metal. As Malric and Ignis walked towards it, the entire world began to wake up. Lines of light traced paths across the floor. Titanic clockwork groaned, ancient gears turning for the first time in eons. The air thrummed with power, a raw, primal ether that responded not to their presence, but to the resonance of their blood. Just as they reached the anvil, the colossal shadow of the starfall blotted out the light from the cavern's crystalline ceiling. A single, gliding elven skiff descended, landing gracefully 100 yards away. The ramp lowered. Queen Ellenweith emerged, alone. Her face was serene, her posture perfect. She was the embodiment of righteous certainty. She glided towards them, her silver robes flowing around her.
"You have led me to a sacred place, thief," she said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. "A place of power you could never hope to comprehend."
Malric stood his ground. Ignis, now at his side, grown to the size of a large wolf and radiating a low, protective growl. "I think I'm starting to get it," Malric replied, placing a hand on the cold star metal anvil. It hummed under his touch, eager. "This place isn't about control, it's about creation."
"You are a flaw,"
she stated, her voice cold with absolute conviction.
"A sickness in the system, a chaotic spark that threatens to burn down the entire world. You cannot control this power. Let me heal it. Let me restore the order you have so grievously broken."
Malric looked down at Ignis, who met his gaze with unwavering gold eyes. He felt the dragon's fierce loyalty, its boundless joy, its simple, powerful love. Then he looked back at the queen. "Order is your word for a cage," Malric said, his voice ringing with a newfound confidence. "He's a dragon. He deserves to fly." The duel began. Ellenweith didn't hesitate. She raised her hands and unleashed a torrent of pure, perfect energy. A lance of white-hot ether, precisely controlled and devastatingly powerful. It was the pinnacle of elven spellcraft. Malric didn't cast a counterspell. He didn't even try to dodge. He slammed his hand on the anvil and yelled, "Shield!" Ignis roared, and a wave of raw power surged from their bond, through Malric and into the forge. In front of him, the forge's immense mechanism slammed a slab of raw ore onto the anvil. The star metal glowed, and a massive shield of interlocking translucent crystal plates erupted from the ground, intercepting the queen's blast. The energy didn't just dissipate, the shield refracted it, shattering the lethal lance into 1,000 harmless, glittering butterflies that fluttered away into the cavern. Ellenweith stared, momentarily stunned. Malric grinned. He wasn't fighting back. He was building. "Let's see," he muttered, his mind racing. "Weight, affinity, what if—" He grabbed a chunk of twisted metal, threw it onto the anvil and yelled, "Reverse affinity!" Ignis barked. The forge whirred. A beam of shivering blue magic shot from a nearby conduit and struck the ground beneath the queen's feet. She didn't fall, she floated. Her graceful poise vanished as she flailed suddenly weightless, drifting helplessly 10 feet into the air.
"This is undignified!"
she shouted, her composure finally cracking. She tried to cast another spell, but her concentration was broken. "You wanted order? I'll give you order," Malric yelled, getting into the rhythm of it. "The order of ridiculous, improvised solutions." He grabbed a pile of scrap, what looked like a busted alchemical bellows and some troll gut tubing. He tossed it on the anvil. "Directive, projectile. Ammunition, poultry. Firing solution, annoyance." The forge complied. A massive, cobbled-together contraption rose from the floor, aimed at the floating queen, and began firing a stream of squawking, enchanted chickens that bounced harmlessly off her magical wards. It was a symphony of chaotic, brilliant, ridiculous invention. He wasn't trying to harm her. He was disarming her, frustrating her, and systematically dismantling her entire philosophy of combat with a barrage of sheer, unadulterated nonsense. The final act was a masterpiece of non-lethal artifice. While the Queen was distracted by the foul assault, Malric worked on his grand finale. He had the forge construct a series of reflective crystalline panels around her. "Hey, Queenie!" he shouted. "Last chance! Stand down!"
"Never, you blight!"
she roared, and gathered all her remaining power for one final, overwhelming blast aimed directly at him. "Your call," Malric said, and gave the anvil one last slap. "Feedback loop! Engage!" The panel snapped into place, forming a perfect cage around her just as she unleashed her spell. The blast hit inside of the cage, reflected to another panel, then another and another, weaving a web of her own contained power around her. It didn't hurt her, but it held her fast, a prisoner in a cage of her own perfect, ordered energy. Her fury exhausted, her power useless, she was forced to simply float there and observe. Ignis, whose size had been subtly increasing throughout the fight, was now as big as a pony. He trotted over to the energy cage, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the metallic floor. He poked his head through the bars of light, which didn't resist him, and licked the Queen's cheek. In that single, shocking moment, Elenweith felt it. She was hit by a sensory overload, a direct feed from the dragon's mind into her own. She felt the lingering, satisfying taste of a half-eaten stick of jerky, the phantom joy of chewing on a perfectly tensioned copper wire bootlace, the echo of a spork violating a runic array not as an act of destruction, but as a moment of triumphant problem-solving. Woven through it all, a bedrock of absolute safety and unwavering trust. All of it aimed at the human. It wasn't an absence of order. She perceived a different, more vibrant kind of logic she couldn't even begin to comprehend. A logic built on creativity, not control. Her millennia of rigid belief, her pride, her fear of chaos, it all cracked. The cage of light flickered and died. She sank gently to the floor, her expression no longer one of anger, but of profound, world-shattering confusion. Aboard the Rusty Mug, the crew watched the final scryed broadcast from the Queen. Her face was projected on every major scrying pool in the Allied kingdoms.
"The dragon has chosen," Elenweith announced, her voice steady but lacking its earlier cold certainty. "It has not been corrupted. It has forged a new path. The Athelian Empire will honor this bond. The bounty on Malric Nightbriar is rescinded. The human and the dragon are to be considered under our protection." The message faded. A collective sigh of relief went through the skyship. Rorik was already calculating the salvage rights to a realm-sized, god-tier workshop.
"Think of the sheer tonnage of high-grade ore!"
Bartholomew, back to chewing on a monaleech vine, grumbled.
"Victory tastes disappointingly like regular air. I was promised ambrosia."
Aella, for the first time, was quietly strumming her lute. A soft, perfectly in-tune melody filled the helm, beautiful and clear.
"You know,"
she said with a small smile,
"for a guy who started all this by making a creative mess of a janitor's enchanted disc, you clean up pretty well."
Malric sat in the pilot's chair, watching Ignis. The dragon, now back to his preferred housecat size, was concentrating intently, trying to shapeshift into a miniature, wobbly version of the Rusty Mug, complete with tiny troll gut binding patches. Malric smiled. The rune on his hand no longer felt like a brand. It felt like a promise. They weren't fugitives anymore. They were a crew, a family, a human artificer, a tone-deaf bard, a dwarven rogue, a cursed goat, and a dragon. They had a battered airship, a full charge in the arcane core, and a sky full of unwritten adventures ahead of them. They were the guardians of a new, chaotic, and brilliant legend.